Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art and culture. And you know, I'm putting together this episode right before I get ready to go on vacation in a day or two for about a week. So this was a pretty meaty thing to assemble last minute. And I just know I said way too much on certain albums that will inevitably piss some people off. But you know, I've never courted popularity. Let's get on the pulse. So again, 10 albums on the docket. Let's first go way back and talk about From Pony Bradshaw, Calico Jim.
Hey, mountain myth gonna see. This old dog will still hunt. I don't need no feather bed. I'm spry as the moon. I won't even break a sweat.
This is the part of this series where I plug in an indie country recommendation from way earlier in the year that, hell, I wanted to cover it half a year ago, but I never had the chance. And oh boy, we got a gem here. A Mississippi-born, now Georgia-based singer-songwriter who broke onto the scene in 2019. What really caught my interest was his swaggering and impressively diverse approach to writing and groove. A little bit of a hangdog vibe, but with a sort of clever, somewhat overwritten lyrics for which I tend to be a pretty easy sell, especially when the hook actually wound up pretty damn good. So coming off of a well-received debut, I really wanted to check out this follow-up that dropped way earlier this year, and it's a really interesting case, and not really the direction that I expected from Pony Bradshaw. For one, the album is a lot more stripped down, playing to certain more intimate tones, certainly very well presented, and the grooves remain surprisingly solid, but it's a pivot towards more restraint that I didn't really expect, outside of a few points where he lets the smoldering electric guitar really roar to sell some lingering darkness, or a ragged fiddle in order to flesh out more of the melody, especially as he doesn't lean on the faux vintage presentation, and that's a nice touch. There's more layered but warm acoustic melodies, supple pedal steel, spare percussion, and whenever there are vocal harmonies, whenever they're integrated, you can tell they come with more purpose in order to fit within the songwriting, normally a more ramshackle group vocal in order to speak for the forgotten people, which contributes to, again, far better hooks than you would expect. But that's where I feel the most striking elements come through on this album. The lyrics are just so detail-rich in painting the rural communities across Appalachia with a level of complexity that defies stereotypes or easy moralism. The proud indigenous man who just trusts all sides of the political spectrum on the opening title track and really just wants to be left alone. The desperate faith of the snake preacher and his flock on Hillbilly Possessed. The spiritual herbalists who are living off the land on Sawtoothed, Jericho, the moonshiners, the addicts who are clinging to whatever life they really have left on Jimmy the Cop and Guru, and far too many who are struggling to find anything left amidst the ravages of the coal industry in those states. And that's the power of just bringing so much detail to the table with very level framing that kind of reminds me a bit of Brent Cobb. You're forced to see a lot of these folks as people, and while I often found myself wishing that Pony Bradshaw would use the extended track lengths to really add a little bit more narrative and storytelling to this, oftentimes the scenes are potent and memorable enough on description alone where it can still feel really visceral. Now, like when I covered Cole Chaney last week, there is a sense that an album like this is just so defiant in its presentation that nobody will care a whit if I say that some of these songs really do meander. But hell, when it's often so well produced and delivered, it's kind of hard for me to care. Another shot of great indie country that I was way too late to talking about. 8 out of 10. If you're a fan of detail and textured writing while still bringing together, again, a lot of solid hooks, you'll like this. Check it out. But you know, while we're on the topic of ponies, from Vylet Pony, Cutiemarks and the Things That Bind.
I was tripping on the phone again. You sounded so depressed. Will you tell, will you tell, will you tell, will you tell? Was it you or me? I just don't know what went wrong. Just wanted to make you smile.
So I've said before that I don't tend to follow or review art within fandom spaces. Not saying it doesn't have value or potency, but more often than not, like a lot of fan work, it can feel a bit derivative, the production can be real spotty, or I'm stuck with material that picks up resonance for those who are in the fandom, but would leave any outside listener minus that context, lacking that connection. And full disclosure, I was never really into My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. I know enough about the show through cultural osmosis that I can follow the references, but but it just wasn't my scene. And yet when a patron threw this artist on my schedule, and I saw a few glowing reviews that seemed uncharacteristically positive for a fan work outside the fandom, I figured I'd throw myself out of my comfort zone, go back through Vylet Pony's back catalog, really give her a chance. And well, okay, she started off in more intimate R&B and bedroom pop, but in more recent projects has embraced a more vibrant, metallic, hyperpop palette that's got a surprising amount of compositional diversity and flair, even if I'd qualify all of that with her weird habits of having her compositions really meander, kinda light on hooks with zero sense of tightness, not helped by her projects usually running way too long. And lyrically, it's definitely material where I think being engaged with the fandom will help add a lot more texture to the emotional journeys that she describes. So now on Cutiemarks here, alright, call it a case of interesting ideas but a serious lack of focus in the execution, which for an act that's already had issues with pacing, hooks, and tightness can make this a bit of a frustrating listen. For starters, this album throws itself across genres from hyperpop to trap to bedroom pop to glossy touches of early 2010s EDM and bro step, complete with all the expected but rather headache-inducing chipmunk vocals. And then there is Protagonist syndrome that literally tries to mash in some of those tones with reggaeton and it does not work at all the way down to some of the sort of undercooked pop rock tones that reflect a desire to appropriate 2000s nostalgia, but missing a lot of the ingredients to really make it work. Mostly now the production has a lot more sizzle than actual muscle due to some really undercooked grooves. And now again, this doesn't surprise me. Predominantly electronic pop acts can struggle bringing in the rock side, but in going for more flashy textures that show a fair bit of Hunter Gex and Glass Beach influence, maybe a dash of Porter Robinson and some of the electronic cuts, Cutiemarks can almost feel overcomposed but a little underproduced, mashing in a lot of ideas but not quite fleshing them out. Now granted, some of this can feel a little bit intentional thematically. This is an album that's trying to strike a chord against being defined solely by one purpose, how the Cutiemarks in question often serve as branding in more ways than one, as constricting as they are illuminating a broader purpose. And also know that I'm jumping into the narrative of this ongoing story midway through, and we're supposed to get a very over-caffeinated, very high school melodrama tone to the writing, but it's also writing that leaps from Equestria to more conventional teen high school setting that's got a very Riverdale quality in how it frames some slightly more adult moments and internal drama. And I gotta say it, keeping track of all the characters and what's actually happening here without distinctive voices or structure, it's kind of a mess. And you know what, this is actually less of a criticism than it's gonna sound, but it reads and flows a lot like fanfiction. The wild shifts in tone and stylism, where ideas are approached but are rarely brought together with a lot of cohesion as you write midway through. But speaking as a former fanfic author, there's so much earnest charm that I can grasp for the moments of quality and raw talent that really do come through. Now, I wouldn't call it a transcendent fanfic that rises above the source material or can really stand alone. The length of this, the lack of refined hooks, they really hold it back here. And as such, it's kind of tough to recommend for non-bronies. But you know what, if you're in the Venn diagram of bronies and Hunter Gex fans, which I do imagine there's probably a lot of overlap, you're gonna find moments that'll click here, so as such, light 6 out of 10. I did not dislike it, I just know it's not for me. But I understand the audience that will get this album. I think they'll have a blast. If you're in that group, check it out. Next up from Dave, We're All Alone in This Together.
My AP costs 31 millimeters, 41 stick. Him up with a stick. Need you the shorter one. You can't short me one. In a club with the shortest one.
So I will freely admit that in 2019, I missed Dave's psychodrama. Part of this is tied to my general detachment from the UK hip-hop scene that year that caused me to miss Slow Tie as well. So when Dave's newest album got added to my schedule, I really wanted to go back, do my due diligence there, and okay, you know, I know this has divided a fair number of critics who were either super hot on the content and the storytelling, the emotional delivery, and those who can appreciate the writing but really can't get into the production or presentation. And I think for psychodrama, I did fall somewhere in the middle here. The writing actually is really potent, it's emotional, and the rapping is well constructed in a way that reminds me of 2000s emo rap, and that's a good thing. But the album also contains a lot of commercial concessions that don't fit within the themes and the atmosphere at all. How Dave centers his narrative can feel occasionally a little bit awkward, and I won't say I was ever wowed by the production, which plays very close to expected sounds within UK hip-hop and could feel impressively dreary, especially when the album ran long. Now, I heard this project was more varied and diverse and still getting a lot of attention, and on some level I get it, but the more listens I gave this, the more I got the feeling that Dave is still trying to set up a balance between all the confessional angst or some reasonably well-formed social commentary and the more commercial tracks that don't always stick the landing. Even if this time around it does feel a little bit better integrated into the framing device of the album. Last time it was therapy, this time it's been offered a role in a movie, which actually adds a layer of artifice and stylization that at least feels a little bit more tonally consistent. But hell, I think part of the problem here is tone. Dave's heavier delivery and comfort with more intricate lyricism lets him flesh out the stories and give cuts like Three Rivers a lot of power in speaking up for immigrant rights in Britain. And when paired with a lot of the pianos and strings, he can actually make some of that drama resonate, especially given just how much space he gives to the instrumental to really breathe. But I gotta say it, when you follow it right after that with a jaunty Afrobeat number with WizKid, it exposes how Dave can't quite elevate the more lightweight commercial tunes and the braggadocious content, especially when he defaults to, let's be honest, a lot of brand name flexing. Maybe fixing some of the woeful sequencing on this album could have helped, play a little bit more into the film arc of how he was tempted by the flash and popularity of the lifestyle. And I can tell he was at least trying to make this work, but the tonal whiplash really hurts the landing, and even despite getting guests like Stormzy and Snow Allegra to really support him here, the one guest that actually just seems to get Dave, who's more serious demeanor and balance of drama and intentions, it's actually James Blake. The two seem to have great artistic chemistry, and how they integrate Sha Simone's cutting bars for a powerful call-out moment on both sides of a smile, that was legit great. What I think frustrates me here most is the potential is so obvious, even to make really good melodic hooks that feel more contemporary. The twinkling violence of 20 to 1, it is a stunningly potent deep cut that screams late autumn winter single, make that happen. And I won't deny that this album shows him growing into more of his ambitions, but also in between some of the occasional corny lines backed up by a raw confidence that really helps them stand out all the more, plus some structural issues where tighter refinement can really help. Dave hasn't quite reached the heights for me just yet. As such, strong 7 out of 10, but again, there are real highlights here, and Dave did a lot more to win me over with this. It's a long listen, but a really good one. Check it out. Next up from Torres, Thirstier.
Keep me in your fantasies, baby. Keep your hands all over me.
I've mentioned before indie acts like Torres. You see them building their own fandom, but minus the big crossover single or the critically acclaimed album, they don't quite hit my radar in the same way. That's what happens in a largely oversaturated market. I don't have time to get to everyone. Now for me, Torres has really been in that category, really since she started dropping albums in the early 2010s. And going through a lot of her back catalog, it feels like a mostly fair assessment. She's a potent, pretty magnetic performer who straddles a lot of art pop and indie rock, and of course started getting the PJ Harvey comparisons very quickly. But while I found myself liking her output, I was rarely wowed. I didn't love it, even if I loved how they integrated New Skin perfectly into an episode of You're the Worst. But from there, she did start building on more of her sound with more glossy, expansive soundscapes and a lot of electronic touches, but the song structures always seemed to meander and really simmer rather than truly explode. Until now. Hell, I don't want to say that Thirstier truly unlocked Torres' appeal for me, but it is her first album that actually seems committed to delivering a lot of consistent hooks, and frankly, it winds up being her most accessible and vibrant by a country mile. And yeah, that might alienate some of the diehard fans that love that stalking simmer, but it sure as hell helped individual cuts stand out more effectively for me, be more memorable, especially as she really didn't surrender much texture or her writing's guttural punch. much. Hell, there's a part of me that wants to say that a pop focus actually helps her out now, helps her grow as a writer. I've been on the record many times that focus, creating a hook, and working within some actual constraints can be a lot harder than many will give it credit. And with this album specifically, I think it's a good fit for her, especially as it adds some sharper immediacy to the raw and reckless stories of taking chances that she sketches, most commonly in love, but Big Leap confronts emotional distance and empathy for a suicidal friend in a really striking way. So alright, on all that basis, we should have a pretty great project here, right? Well, to be honest, I wish I liked it a lot more outside of some of its more standout moments, because while Thirstier is more accessible, it's also a lot less consistent. I think my big issue comes down to how a lot of the grooves feel really blocky and jerky, pulling from more industrial rock tones, but not always nailing the subtleties and the texture or the flow of the album, particularly in the transition between the roars of distorted guitars and the more electronic noise. And some of it simply comes down to the pop sensibilities just requiring a little bit more refinement to be as potent as they could be. The album feels transitional in getting there, and hell, the title track kicks so much ass that the drop-off for the final 3 songs kind of a letdown, gotta say. Overall, though, it's probably the most I've enjoyed and will return to a Torres album, so even if I don't think this is quite great, solid 7 out of 10. If you want to jump on point, this is a damn good one. Check it out. Next up from Creeper, American Noir. Admit I shouldn't be surprised that Creeper followed up their last project with something so fast. I mean, I really loved it, but it didn't seem to catch the wave of hype that their debut did. I suspect mostly because of the big change in the sound. Now, I will say it's a little bit odd to have their new project called American Noir, especially as, again, this is a UK band, but it's just an EP, and you can tell from their last album, you can tell Creeper has always really enjoyed toying with classic subversions of Americana and the grand meatloaf tradition, and yet off of this EP, I don't know, I keep feeling that they could have done a lot more with it. Now, granted, part of this is structured as an epilogue to the wildly melodramatic story they were telling on that 2020 album, with a lot more focus on Hannah Greenwood's vocal presence, and I gotta say, that's a nice touch. I often thought she's been really shortchanged a bit, even if I think she could afford to vamp a little bit more. But I don't know, if it's some of the production shortcomings that are still slipping through here, especially with some of the underpowered drums and the muddy mixing that cannot quite sell the dynamic that they really want. Please get this band in with a producer who can give them a little bit more. Or it's the fact that their American reference points, they feel really damn flimsy around all the gothic vampire trappings that feels even tougher to follow. But you know, I kept thinking that so many of these moments should properly explode more effectively, especially as the bass grooves got some really welcome reinforcement, the horns, they are back in earnest and they sound better than ever, and the guitar work might be the most dynamic and splashy that it's ever been. Maybe it's the fact that we've got an 8-song EP and we've got an intro, outro, and instrumental passage that don't add all that much, or the lingering feeling that there are 3 legit great songs here, Midnight, One of Us, Damned and Doomed, and they should have really just been tacked onto the album from last year. I would have been fine with it. But the last time I covered a gothic epilogue project, it was Phantoms by Mariana Trench. And now I want Creeper in the studio with Josh Ramsey. Tell me that would not kick ass. Anyway, with it being an EP, it's a good sampler. Light 7 out of 10 if you're curious, but more for Creeper fans who are looking for more. That's all I'm saying. Next up from Yola, Stand For Myself.
We know it isn't, it ain't gonna turn out right. We know it isn't, we know it isn't. Oh Lord, we know it isn't. That's why we got to fight.
Well, this is long coming. I first became aware of Yola for her excellent verse on the title track of The Highwomen, and then made a twit of myself by misstating her name. I didn't even find the time to cover her debut album from that same year. Well, I made the time, I went back to check out Walk Through Fire, and while I was never wild about Dan Auerbach's slavish attention to retro fetishism and the reverb-saturated production, Yola is the sort of tremendous talent as a performer to pull me in regardless. It was a pretty great little album album that I'm still kind of kicking myself that I didn't cover, especially as now listening to Stand For Myself, I actually think I might like Walk Through Fire more. I think part of that is because there's a little bit less country on this album in comparison with going pure retro soul and even smatterings of R&B, which, yeah, seems to be a more natural fit for the groovy, organ-inflected palette that Dan Auerbach has once again given her. And sure, it's certainly credible in this lane, because Dan Auerbach nails most of the texture, and Yola's got the sheer, raw expressiveness and charisma in her huge voice. She's raw and fiery in some of the gospel runs and the way that the best soul is, and you could argue that going more traditional in its tones gives this a little bit more accessibility to a broader audience, especially as some of that country twang is still creeping in. But I don't know, this is one of those cases where the more balanced country soul fusion gave her material a little bit more uniqueness to me, especially because while Dan Auerbach's production might be well balanced and pretty flavorful, especially in a lot of the horn sections, his production and engineering crew is not elevating the style with more warmth or added texture like, say, Dave Cobb can, especially in a lot of the vocal mixing. Kind of a shame, because when you actually drill into some of the content on this album, Yola's arc in the content is pretty damn potent and effective, starting off really slow to find and center herself in hostile spaces, which can be a trial in and of itself, but also then express warmth and sensuality while working through some of past demons and relationships. And not only is there a lot of early 70s conscious soul coming through in some of the exasperation of inequality on Diamond-Studded Shoes, and perhaps the best song about allyship I think I've ever heard in Be My Friend, but some of the tender love stories that might start off retrospectively framed on Dancing Away the Tears, before flowing into the more sober reflections on Starlight, that then charges into the righteous kiss-off and reclamation of confidence on Whatever You Want, and that closing title track, they feel really earned and righteous. It's a good arc. So yeah, to sum this up, it's a great album, but I don't know, I still think Yola's got even greater heights to reach, and I still think I like her debut just a little bit more. So yeah, 8 out of 10. High recommendation, but now that I'm on the train, finally, I want to see where she goes next. It's gonna be something special. Next up from Isaiah Rashad, The House is Burning.
Came out buzzing, 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 came out buzzing. Wait.
Okay, look, I think it's important to mention right from the jump that I've been kinda struggling with Isaiah Rashad's album since my lukewarm response to the Sun's tirade and how much backlash that got. The meandering wallow of that album, it had resonance in the ideas and the deeper insight, and I won't deny the atmosphere is potent, but there were issues of vocal delivery, pacing, and this real haggard texture that kept me from really embracing it more deeply, especially as I could tell and explain why all of his choices were intentional. It just didn't work for me. But I remember when I reviewed that album and I found myself worrying that the 2-year break between Sylvia Demo and that album was due to a lot of depression and substance abuse issues that could potentially hamper his career. And now it's 5 years later, and only now do we have a new album, one that's already seen some contentious discourse that inevitably I'm going to put myself in. But I can see why, because once again, Isaiah Rashad delivered a project that is stronger on implication and potential than it is on execution, especially if you're still hoping for the lyricism on the level of Sylvia Demo, and that's just not happening. See, the numbing effects of hedonism, they've always been an intrinsic part to Isaiah Rashad's vibe and appeal. There's always been a lot of relatability to his sound, and if you're gonna get anything out of this project, it's gonna be that smoked out Memphis and Southern knock, where the menace underscoring everything is the point. The house that's burning here is his own, be it through a lot of empty flexes, meaningless sex, drug abuse, and the paranoia that's been driven from that street-level violence. The new gods that he's had to choose to embrace because the old gods have failed him. And this album is what lies in that wake. In a way, it reminds me a little bit of Ab-Soul's These Days, but nowhere near as lyrical or explicitly satirical, where you get the point that Isaiah Rashad is trying to make in juxtaposing the hard-hitting vibes of this sound with the underlying darkness. It's not that revolutionary, but his delivery is too comfortably numb to engage with as deeply as you might want, really pull the audience in, especially as on a couple tracks here, he shows he's capable of that old energy and spark, and just is not delivering it. And when nearly every other guest star around him steps up with more presence, and on some tracks Isaiah Rashad sounds like he's barely engaged at all, or he's coasting on the assumption that this brand of southern hip-hop doesn't have to be as lyrical, which is neither fair nor true, I get why he might consider this more of a love it or hate it passion project. Although if that's the truth, why'd get so defensive over the middling reviews, but that's neither here nor there. But here's the thing, when I got what this was, and I adjusted my expectations, for what it's worth, I actually did wind up liking it a little bit more. It's absolutely more disposable, and I wish that Isaiah Rashad sounded more like he cared, but songs like Claymore and True Story, they were saved by their guest verses from Smino and J-Rock respectively, and I actually really like the loose jazzy side of Headshots for the Vocals and Don't Shoot, and I actually think the album does try somewhat to pull things together by the very end on Happy Birthday to You. So with all that in mind, I know it's going to be controversial, but 6 out of 10, like with the Sun's Tirade, I get what this is doing. I just think I might have expected something a little different, and I couldn't catch hold of the new vibes. That's all. Next up from Bleachers, Take the Sadness Out of Saturday Night.
Say goodbye, you made it. Stop, turn on this heart. Just say goodbye like you made it. Say goodbye like you made it.
You know, going back to when I covered Strange Desire back in 2014, when Fun had effectively broken up and Jack Antonoff was taking a wild indie rock swing, it became very obvious just how indebted to certain sounds he really was. The Springsteen influences, they were always there in some capacity, but what went overlooked was just how much Jack Antonoff also idolizes Billy Joel, and building a lot of robust melody lines and his own stylization of swaggering New York, New Jersey Americana. Now, both sides were very evident on Gone Now in 2017, even if that project was a mess of undercooked hooks and wonky production that I probably overrated. But in the lead up to this album 4 years later, that competing dynamic between Billy Joel and Springsteen kept slipping into my mind, especially given that Bruce Springsteen himself is on this album. Now granted, this project is also overstuffed with tension and all these little dichotomies. Jack Antonoff has described this album as wanting to hold on to joy and not understanding why he can't, which leads to frustration and anger boiling over in so many places, and that's very Billy Joel, especially with the slightly sour subtext that his breakup with such an overwhelming personality like Lena Dunham has kind of left him a little bit adrift. And that has the feel of someone who is coming home with all those nervous energy to re-examine everything about his life, especially his family relationships and the expectations that he's then placed upon himself. It's not really a breakup album per se, but more of a what the hell do I do now that it's all over album, only intensified by the lockdowns of the past year, which was ramped up that manic impulse. Now, the funny thing is there are albums in this tradition. One that immediately springs to mind is the criminally underrated Daughter by Lydia Lovelace from last year, but you can tell from at least the writing that Jack Antonoff intended this as a much angrier album, which he tries to temper by aligning some songs in matching pairs, one after the other, in order to flesh out some context, framing that's intended to add more complexity, but might make Jack Antonoff look a little bit worse in the result. And you know what? For what he's trying to do, that's a good thing. Cause man, he needs the rough edges in the writing, because Jack Antonoff just cannot sell proper anger as a vocalist. Now, part of this is the production that doesn't really center him all that well. Part of it is the fact he's always been a limited presence behind the mic, especially given that for some reason he's using less of his lower register, which has some nice gravelly texture I've always liked, but also because this album worships at the altar of Bruce Springsteen, and Bleachers has always been a band that makes these huge, major key, hook-driven anthems that don't really contain a lot of darkness. Ironically, he wants to hold the rage too, and doesn't seem to get why he can't. Now, I say all this with the acknowledgement that this album winds up way more consistently fun as a result. I still did really enjoy this, and hell, some of the greatest moments of Strange Desire, they were all about Jack Antonoff flailing in mid-breakdown. That's what made them awesome. But when the influences are this obvious, with all the saxophone, the creaking acoustics, the staccato pianos, the holes in Bleachers' formula formula are kind of hard to overlook or ignore, like how weirdly piecemeal and sloppy some of the mixing feels with so many inconsistent fidelities, and specifically how the bass lines are just criminally underpowered. And what's so exasperating is that outside of all that, and the fact that the album kind of runs out of gas by the very end, this could have been easily as good as Strange Desire if some of the messiness was brought under control, even if the messiness was part of the point. Now, granted, again, Bleachers has always been messy, and the transcendent moments, they blow through strongly enough to nudge this to an extremely light 8 out of 10 and a recommendation, because, again, this is still Bleachers, I'm still a fan, and the best songs here are truly special, but I also know this is a band that's too damn hooky and wild to not grow on me further. For your endless season, y'all have been warned. Next up from Foxing, Draw Down the Moon.
If I could, I would have done it by now. We circle like salmon in holy pools, gathering speed until we can't slow down. You said.
And while we're on the topic of some of the best albums of the 2010s, okay, Foxing blew me out of the water with Near My God in 2018. It was a grandiose, emo-infused indie rock statement that was dense, political, and showed the band expanding their sound like never before. You'd think a bigger label would take notice and sign them after their deal with Triple Crown ended. Maybe just bad timing though. Meanwhile, the band lost one of their guitarists, recruited John Congleton and Andy Hull of Manchester Orchestra to help with writing and production, and then they actually self-released this project with a distribution deal through Hopeless. And you know what? I was legit really excited to see if this could measure up to the hype, which has gotten frankly bigger than I was expecting, and, well, I'm of a few minds on this. For one, in comparison with the grandiose, explosive scope of Near My God, Draw Down the Moon is way more compact, hook-driven, and relatively straightforward in a way that they've never been before. And if I were more cynical, this might reflect a band that just wants to score an alternative hit already. They've been working on the outside looking in for a while, they actually want to make some money. I've heard some accusations of selling out in comparison to the 1975 of all bands, which is neither fair or all that accurate, but there is a part of me that understands where that comes from if you were brought in on the high concept statement of Near My God, like I was, which is why as a smaller album statement, this does not have the same impact. That being said though, I also can't deny that Foxing are really good at streamlining their formula and writing songs that try to be more catchy, more immediate. There's more hooks here. Maybe with nothing better than Game Shark, but that's also one of the best indie rock songs of the 2010s. That's a rather impossibly high standard for them to hit again. And more importantly, the other touchstones of their sound and a lot of their production, they are still here. The vocals are still throat shredding. The melodic grooves still have a lot of distorted texture and real punch to them. The synthesizers, the electronic effects, they are very well blended, and this band still has their bombast. Really, the biggest changes in sound are just compositional structure and better pacing. And if that makes a song like Where the Lightning Strikes Twice sounds like a top-tier Killers song, why exactly am I complaining? Now, I have seen some people bring up the lyrics, that they are playing to more conventional territory in fighting back against adversity, material that Foxing has approached with a lot more depth and complexity on previous albums. And I kind of got mixed opinions on that too. On the one hand, yes, it does feel like many of the ideas here are a little simplified in order to fit a more singles and song-driven focus, but it's not like it's not thematically consistent or doesn't touch on a reality that can feel as desperately urgent, like the debt described on Go Down Together, the struggle of maintaining artistic inspiration on Where the Lightning Strikes Twice, the heartbreakingly numb depression of At Least We Find the Floor and Cold-Blooded, then grappling with death on Speak with the Dead, even Connor Murphy coming out as bisexual on Beacons, it really comes through. And I don't know, it just feels kind of crass to trivialize all that because the writing is more blunt and direct, especially when the emotionality feels just as ragged and potent and the songs still go for broke. That being said, I think I still miss some of the grandeur that comes in the compositions, but I also understand how difficult that might be to recapture, especially after their past year and who knows what their budget was. So 8 out of 10. It's still pretty great, and if there's an album that should break Foxing through, it will probably be this one. It's in the shadow of their peak, but still good. Check it out. And finally, from The Killers, Pressure Machine.
Families are tight. Good people, they still don't deadbolt their doors at night. In this quiet town.
Okay, was I the only one a little uneasy about just how quickly the Killers rolled this out? It didn't seem like there were singles to match the slam dunks from Imploding the Mirage, and even if the pandemic gave them more time to write music and work with the same production team, the turnaround time felt ridiculously fast. And the buzz was really weird behind this album too. Some were describing it as Sam's Town 2, some highlighting how it was the closest thing the Killers have ever made to a Bright Eyes album. It just felt really goddamn weird. So I had no idea what I was getting into with this album, and in truth, I don't quite think either description is really adequate here. In short, this is a concept album exploring the small town of Nephi that Brandon Flowers grew up in, attempting to balance the mythos of the American small town with the reality of such a place nowadays. Isolation amidst a desert expanse, falling into traditional family roles, a sense of lingering decay, and, of course, the opioid epidemic, which has swept through it in recent years, complete with a collection of samples from folks in the town describing their experiences. In short, this is the Killers trying to make their Nebraska, if it wasn't obvious for every blast of harmonica. And while I can applaud the ambition, there's a part of me that just can't shake the feeling this is completely out of their wheelhouse. Part of this is the feeling that indie country has laid claim to a lot of this subject matter, and while they might not have the sweep of the Killers, they sure as hell get the texture and the writing and delivery. Think Ian Noe, or Jason Isbell, or Laurie McKenna, or very early Casey Musgraves. But I also think tone is a major factor here too. Brandon Flowers loves to play for big, yearning emotions of operatic scope, and when the band goes for broke with sheer reckless bombast, they knock it out of the park. But this is the sort of subject matter and the more grounded human stories, they demand a level of complexity of framing that the Killers never really had. Not so much melodrama, the Killers could handle that, but these topics don't fit cleanly into a straightforward tribute, and whenever Brandon Flowers tries to include the detail on slightly more optimistic songs, the awkwardness of the sincere juxtaposition is really hard to overlook. Like on Quiet Town, or how they try to bring it all together on the Getting By, especially when the band doesn't have the certified glorious anthems that they used to be able to lean on, and especially given all these vocal samples that put it all front and center. The weird thing is that on some level, the Killers seem kind of aware of the contradiction on cuts like Cody, probably one of my favorite songs here, but even there, it's not really awareness that translates to depth or deeper commentary. And hell, outside of Runaway Horses with Phoebe Bridgers, and maybe the title track courtesy of some truly stunning falsetto from Flowers, I'm honestly not sure they really grasp it in going for smaller sounds here either. That's the other thing. If the Killers had actually resolved the issues of the blocky, clunky mixing from Imploding the Mirage and had the massive hooks, I feel like I would be more forgiving of this album. For as much as Jonathan Ratto and Sean Everett can capture the Americana texture and the sense of some of the scope, the mix still feels really overcompressed and clumsily blended to bring it all together, especially when it feels like there's just so little subtlety and dynamics to all the mixing, and especially with some of those oppressively loud elements that they slam to the forefront, especially the guitars. A song like Desperate Things, given a little bit more space to really breathe, to accentuate the loneliness, it could have been something special. It could have been transcendent, let me tell you. I don't know. I can respect the intentions behind this project, and maybe I'm just a sucker for the sound, that I think this tilts onto the side of good. Hell, given my reviews of Bleachers and Foxing just in this video, it makes sense. But this is not an album that plays to the Killers' strengths, and if anything, exposes some really sharp limitations, especially at a time where, again, it feels like I've covered so many pictures of small-town Americana that just get it better. So, extremely light 7 out of 10. This will have its fans. It's probably the definition of a cult album, but if you're looking for stuff in this territory, there's a lot better out there. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I know I'm late with some of this, and I know it's going to be contentious, but hey, that's what the comments are for. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process and potentially get projects on my schedule, and which I will be likely covering after I get back from vacation, there's the option to go to my Patreon right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times, I understand. I'll be fine. But if you want to, there's the option. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.